Success can be a tricky thing to achieve in the video game industry. It is difficult enough to make a complex piece of interactive software that is functional and technically competent, let alone making one that is fun to play. It can equally be challenging for any developer, large or small, to find a big enough audience for their game in a highly competitive marketplace. And after all that, success will often boil down to how it looks on a company spreadsheet within its first few weeks, which can be all that decides its exciting future or its premature death. But sometimes, success in video games can be less about simple sales numbers, and more about the unexpected influence and legacy that they leave behind for others to carry on. When EA Redwood Shores was founded in 1998, they weren't designed to be anything more than a journeyman studio of electronic arts. Hidden away within the company headquarters of Redwood City, California, their output was almost entirely made up of licensed sports games and movie tie-ins. From Tiger Woods to Lord of the Rings to James Bond, they merely existed to fill out the release calendar for EA, and to make way for the tentpole blockbusters of other studios. By 2005, after years of uninspiring work, the developers of Redwood Shores felt that it was now or never to push themselves to the next level. Since EA claimed the intellectual property rights at the time, they initially kicked around the idea of developing the long-awaited third installment in the System Shock franchise. However, they decided instead to create a brand new original IP, taking inspiration from the immersive sci-fi horror of System Shock 2 and the third-person shooting action of Resident Evil 4. And after spending 18 months building prototypes and persuading the executive leadership, Redwood Shores finally received a green light to what would become Dead Space. When the game finally launched on October 14, 2008, it barely sold 1 million units across all platforms within its first 4 months. It was deemed a commercial disappointment by its publisher, but it nevertheless became a modern classic for its action horror gameplay and its mastery of atmosphere and world building. But more importantly for Redwood Shores, Dead Space proved to their bosses and to the world that they had the capabilities to become a true AAA game studio. The following year, they rebranded themselves as Visceral Games, and much like DICE and BioWare before them, they were put in charge of an entire genre division within EA, focused on developing M-rated third-person action games for the company. But this rapid growth did not translate into long-term sustainability for Visceral. Tens of millions of dollars were poured into comic books, novels, and animated movies that tried and failed to push Dead Space and Dante's Inferno over the top into mainstream popularity. Each subsequent sequel put greater and greater pressure on its developers to reach unrealistic sales expectations, until the action-heavy Dead Space 3 finally drove the franchise into the ground. And although the EA bear hug would eventually come to crush Visceral Games into oblivion, that 2008 game will always remain important for enabling its creators to break out of mediocrity and finally make their long-lasting mark on the industry. 15 years later, history is repeating itself with the two studios once again looking to Dead Space to help shape their new identities. Just like Visceral before them, EA Motive has only had 2 licensed Star Wars games and a cancelled action adventure IP to their name since their founding in 2015. The Dead Space remake marks their first time working with the original EA franchise, and if it can find success where the original couldn't, it would certainly help them stand out within EA, and might even give them the trust to take stewardship of Dead Space into the future. And as for Striking Distance Studios, former Visceral Studio head Glenn Schofield wants to channel the nostalgia and magic of his most famous creation into the Callisto Protocol. And by doing so, he's hoping that their debut game would not only launch his new studio out into the world, but also help his South Korean publisher Krafton expand deeper into Western markets. With the incredible coincidence of having these two similar games coming out within mere months of each other, I want to take the opportunity to make a double feature review of the Callisto Protocol and the Dead Space remake, and to see how they interpret the sci-fi action horror of the original Dead Space in their own unique ways. Ever since it was first revealed to the world, the Callisto Protocol has had plenty of high expectations thrust upon it. Succeeding the legacy of the cult classic Dead Space was always going to be a daunting task, and even with many of its former developers in leadership positions at striking distance, attempting to achieve that in the debut game of a new and untested studio would certainly make that task far more difficult. But at least in terms of its production value, the Callisto Protocol certainly meets and exceeds those expectations. It really embodies the greatest aspects of what people mean when they say next-gen presentation. Every room and corridor in Callisto has been designed with such intricate level geometry and the most photorealistic detail that I've ever seen in a video game. Its ray-traced lighting and particle effects greatly enhance the atmosphere of its metal dungeons and underground caverns. Sometimes, just taking in all the spectacular sights and sounds around you can be enough to really sell the visual spectacle of Black Iron Prison. Striking Distance devoted most of their resources into developing this high-quality, cinematic, action horror experience, and in that respect, it has undeniably paid off well for the young studio. But that devotion also brings with it the majority of my problems with the Callisto Protocol. The game wants you to admire the craftsmanship and the technology that went into its presentation, and to completely immerse yourself into its cinematic atmosphere. At the same time, it also wants to thoroughly streamline its gameplay and minimize its depth and interactivity in order to make the act of playing as non-intrusive to the player as possible. It frequently railroads you into this curated linear experience, and forces you to play the game in the exact way that it wants to be played. And this design philosophy starts to become particularly noticeable in how the one-on-one melee combat at Callisto is played out. Admittedly, the first few enemy encounters can look really brutal and impressive in action, when you're bobbing and weaving around biophages like a professional boxer, and smashing bloody chunks off their bodies with your baton. It takes a unique approach in translating the shooting combat of Resident Evil 4, and adapting that towards the melee-heavy focus for Callisto. Just like how Leon had to stop in place in order to make precision shots at enemies, Jacob has to stay dangerously close in order for melee strikes to connect, which helps to communicate the tension and risk that survival horror combat should entail. That novelty certainly differentiates Callisto from its spiritual predecessor and from its contemporaries, but once that combat gets stretched out across hours of gameplay on the hardest difficulty, it starts to show how undercooked and limiting its melee mechanics really are. You can begin to see the key differences between Callisto and Dead Space by how their combat systems are reflected in the designs of their enemies. Each necromorph type had their own distinct silhouette, sounds, animations, and attacks that made them extremely recognizable and distinct from one another. Exploders waddle towards you with large explosive sacks that can be detonated prematurely. Lurkers can crawl on walls and shoot ranged barbs in their tentacles. And even the most basic slasher has their blade arms raised high above their heads. Besides allowing for truly grotesque monster designs, they also created affordances of how the player could interact with them in mind, and how they could creatively tear them apart limb from limb. It made the act of third-person shooting far more exciting when you had to utilize your arsenal weapons and their alternate fire modes against different and multiple necromorphs. But in Callisto, since the melee combat only seems to work with human-shaped enemies, most of the biophage end up becoming generic zombies with 2 arms and 2 legs. And because they all move and attack in the exact same way, it quickly reduces combat to a very rigid sequence of actions. All you have to do is dodge up to 3 consecutive attacks, press R2 until your combo ends, maybe pop off a couple of shots, and repeat. The gravity restraint projector can help stunlock enemies or toss them into environmental hazards, but by and large, this is how you will fight every single biophage in the game, regardless of whether they are a grunt, a spitter, a rusher, or even if they are enhanced. There is very little combo variation for such a melee-heavy game, since the only active moves that you can unlock are heavy attacks and leg sweeps, and even then, purchasing heavy attacks only enables you to manually perform the move at will with the R1 button. If you pull an enemy towards you, your next melee attack will automatically be a heavy attack, even if you haven't unlocked it yet. The rest of the melee upgrades are just shortcuts that don't offer the player any creative expression during combat. One passive upgrade will shatter an enemy's arm, but only if the AI decides to attempt to block. And destroying one arm will cause the biophage to only throw out one attack at a time, which further simplifies the combat to an unchallenging slog. Another late upgrade that costs 2,700 credits increases the chances of enabling a quick aim target on exposed tentacles, which is practically worthless since you're encouraged to manually aim at these tentacles anyway to accomplish the same result. Strategic dismemberment returns as a core feature in the Callisto Protocol, though the precision aiming at Dead Space has been downplayed in favor of what Callisto calls strategic targeting. After completing a melee combo, a target will appear on their head or arms, and aiming your weapon will automatically lock onto that target. It enables you to deal specific damage to that limb until it is destroyed, stun-locking enemies and opening them up to further combos. While it does facilitate dismemberment in the fast-paced and close-quarters nature of its melee combat, strategic targeting isn't very strategic as a mechanic. It automatically decides where and when you can shoot your enemies, and reduces your agency down to an extremely one-sided decision. Do you choose to drag out combat encounters using only melee mechanics? Or do you go fishing for those quick shots to end the fight far quicker? Strategic targeting might make the violence and gore more spectacular, but it doesn't make for an interesting or satisfying dynamic to consider during combat. When it comes to dodging, you don't even have to worry about timing windows or opposite inputs. You can hold any direction on the left stick, which you can do long before any biophage is within range, and then you only have to alternate between left or right when they do a combo attack. Despite how easy this seems, Callisto does a poor job of explaining it, as the combat introduction is limited to a non-interactive QTE sequence, and static tutorial screens that don't adequately teach you how to fight enemies in real time. I was overthinking dodging so much that until my second playthrough, I was frantically trying to time to enemy attacks like you would in any traditional action or fighting game. This simplicity also discourages first-time players from using melee to attack crawling enemies, as it seems completely unintuitive to move your upper body to dodge an enemy that is at your feet. and the game doesn't adequately explain that can be a viable option besides shooting them. And all of this becomes particularly troublesome when it comes to boss fights, or should I say, the one boss you have to fight 4 times over in a row. The twin head is much larger than regular enemies, and doesn't exactly fit the established model of how you have fought every other enemy up to this point. They only throw out one long wind-up attack at a time, meaning that you can hold one direction for the entire fight and never get hit once. But with its long, uninterruptible animations, dealing consistent damage on the twin head with a baton is completely non-viable during normal gameplay. Instead, you are supposed to pump them full of lead with your weapons until they go down, which can become a real problem if you happen to run out of ammo during a fight. And trying to use only the baton and no weapons makes boss encounters literally impossible to beat. And when one half of an entire combat system is rendered useless because this melee-heavy horror game couldn't provide an answer to a design problem, that is pretty disappointing. To be fair, I don't envy the designers who probably had their hands tied working with this flashy but ultimately flawed combat model. And I can certainly understand how other people can find empowerment in the simple beat-em-up rhythms of the game. But for me, even if Callisto had a New Game Plus mode at launch, there was very little of the gameplay that is worth going back to after the credits roll. Despite this, games like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice have proven that linear gameplay and simplistic combat can still achieve great horror if the story and presentation are strong enough to carry the overall experience. The concept of Callisto having a corporation that uses the convicts of its private prison colony to conduct biological experiments on a frozen moon is ripe with potential. But beyond its blood and gore, the game does very little to sustain this horror over the long term. Besides repetitive and occasionally unavoidable jump scares of parasites and grabbers that force you to button mash, so much of the storytelling is wasted on the bare bones mechanics of escaping Black Iron, that in between cutscenes, there is little to no effort towards developing its characters, unfolding its narrative, or expanding its fiction. Most chapters simply have Jacob walking quietly down dark corridors, bringing fuses to fuse boxes, and slowly moving through one-way air ducts and tight spaces. And without enough character interactions, action set pieces, or additional story context, Callisto can't keep the narrative moving at a steady pace, or make what the player is doing interesting. The rare radio calls that Jacob receives are limited to the immediate objective of escaping the prison, and the few characters you interact with are written with such one-note predictability and laziness. Take for example Elias, whose only personality trait before and after his death is that he knows everything about the prison.
Yeah, well, look, I've been in here half my life. I know this place. Look, I've been here a long time. I've got privileges that you don't. Well, look, I've been here forever. Right, I've got all the information on this place and I can get us to the hangar.
I swear, Jacob, I had no idea who she was.
I thought you knew everything about this place.
He knew Black Iron like the back of his hand.
Or Ferris, the asshole prison captain who is reborn as this cartoonish mutant bodybuilder who makes childish taunts at Jacob. Or Cole, who occasionally gives melodramatic bad guy monologues over holograms to remind the player that there actually is a main villain before the end of the game. What compounds the horrendous pacing and cliched writing of Callisto is its approach to world building. Dead Space utilized audio and text logs in the service of establishing its fictional universe and enhancing the believability of the USG Ishimura as its setting. Through crew reports, personal diaries, private emails, and more, they told stories about the people, places, groups, and events leading up to and during the Necromorph outbreak, with even more lore dumps being unlocked in New Game Plus. They even introduced supporting characters like Mercer and Kyne long before they appeared in the main story, which only integrated the lore deeper with the rest of the gameplay experience. But in Callisto, there isn't enough mystery or intrigue to uncover about Black Iron Prison, the United Jupiter Company, or the Biophage outside of what is directly told to you in the main story. Most of the audio logs consist of the most basic boilerplate information that either rephrases something a character has already said or done, or states blatantly obvious the environmental storytelling should already be doing. Some logs will even have very audible breaks between two speakers, even though realistically they should be overlapping each other.
Please, you gotta help me. Sir, I need you to calm down. No, it's in my head! I need you to calm down and answer the question. Now, when was your first exposure? Please, it hurts!
And what's worse, audio logs don't autoplay when you pick them up, and you can't passively listen to them in the background while you're walking around. Instead, the game forces you to stop dead in your tracks and pull up your inventory screen in order to access them. I can't imagine why the narrative designers would want to deliberately waste their time like this, unless they were worried that they might distract the player from the prearranged ambiance and scares that they had spent so much time preparing beforehand. The Callisto Protocol tries to build itself up to the big revelation that Jacob had suppressed his memories of delivering the biophage from Callisto to Europa, and is partly responsible for causing both the outbreaks there. But unless you went out of your way to find the few missable audio logs that foreshadow this, The critical path does nothing to effectively build up to this point in a satisfying, logical way. After the prologue, the connections between Jacob and Europa won't be brought up again until a cutscene 3 hours later, when Elias makes a very pointed reference about guilt and responsibility to Jacob, literally moments before he's killed off. Then, there is nothing until another cutscene about 40 minutes later, when Danny confronts him at his wrecked ship about the cargo he was carrying, and then another cutscene 2 hours after that, where he discovers the biophage in the lab at the Arcus colony. This wouldn't be such a problem if there were other things going on to fill the time, like if there were other prisoners that Jacob had come across, or if there were unique side stories that follow in the lore or in certain levels, but there isn't any of that. The story only happens during cutscenes when it becomes absolutely necessary to move things along, which completely kills any narrative momentum to an agonizing crawl. Instead, Callisto resorts to having a deus ex machina in the form of Dr. Mahler to explain everything to the player all at once. After introducing herself to Jacob in the first chapter, she never reappears again outside of optional logs until the penultimate chapter, when her hologram conveniently appears out of nowhere to finally explain what the biophage is and how it is related to Arcus and Black Iron. Then, in the next chapter, Mahler frees Jacob from his jail cell, and minutes before the final boss, she uploads Danny's memories of the Europa outbreak directly to his consciousness, gives Jacob half the antidote to cure the biophage, explains why Cole unleashed the outbreak at the prison, and introduces the Illuminati death cult that was behind the entire game, which will come completely out of nowhere for most first-time players who didn't find the secret rooms. All this so that Jacob can finally realize that the Cube toy, which he first sees in a news broadcast about Europa and hallucinates throughout the game, was actually the biophage pathogen all along in a last-minute twist, even though he has absolutely no frame of reference for this beforehand. I'm guessing they were trying to suggest that Jacob had unconsciously projected his guilt onto that toy, which just so happened to be the exact smoking gun that he was looking for. And to top it all off, the mutant bodybuilder reappears so he can transform into a bullet sponge final boss that conspicuously reuses the sound of the slasher from Dead Space. A final, unwelcome reminder of the game that Callisto was so heavily inspired by, but fails to match in just about every way. Overall, I found the Callisto Protocol to be an undercooked, flawed, and disappointing action horror experience. Much of its strength lies in the spectacle of its photorealistic graphics and cinematic atmosphere. It is certainly an impressive feat to behold when you take the time to stop and appreciate the craftsmanship that went into it. But that spectacle comes at the expense of designing a rewarding combat system, or telling an effective sci-fi horror story. Its mixed melee and weapons combat is visually impressive, but it doesn't provide the player with enough complexity and creative expression to sustain itself over its 8-hour campaign. It's telling that barely 2 weeks after launch, patches would drastically buff the game by increasing animation speeds for weapon switching and healing, reducing the damage of being surrounded by enemies, and making the already easy dodging even easier. Those mechanics that were originally designed to encourage disempowerment and tension have been watered down to the point of turning it into an action game, with the shallow pretense of horror. Its narrative is too unfocused to create any kind of emotional investment, and its half-hearted approach towards backstory and lore are not enough to build the depth and intrigue that is critical for the kind of world building that Callisto wants to have. For some, the simplicity and straightforwardness of Callisto might be all that they need out of a good horror game. But if you try to dig deeper beyond the curated experience that has been meticulously laid out for you, there's little else of substance that can compensate for the rest of its mediocrity. If somebody asked me what I would do if I had the power to remake any video game in the world, Dead Space would probably not be anywhere on my list. My initial reaction to the announcement was one of excitement, but also with a twinge of disappointment. The franchise being brought back not for that long-awaited reboot, but for an extremely safe remake of a game that has already aged very gracefully over the past 15 years. On one hand, I can understand the feelings of hostility that some people have regarding the remake. It doesn't take much to see the short-sighted greed behind EA shutting down a beloved developer like Visceral Games, and then bringing it back just to cash in on nostalgia and the recent Resident Evil remakes. But for motive, after developing 2 licensed Star Wars games that they obviously didn't have full creative control on, it must have seemed like exactly the right pitch to make to their bosses. A cult horror classic that is fully owned by their publisher, a 7th-gen shooter with plenty of easy opportunities to improve the overall experience, and a AAA remake that would clearly demonstrate their capabilities and their worth to their bosses within EA. And after going through 3 back-to-back playthroughs of the game, the Dead Space remake is certainly a high-quality action horror experience and a worthy companion to the original game. It isn't as radical a reimagining as Resident Evil 2 was to its 1998 counterpart, though it still retains all the core elements that made up the original Dead Space, while modernizing and enhancing it in a few key areas. The Yuji Ishimura is often regarded as among the most iconic locations in all of video games, and for good reason. Just like the Spencer Mansion and Rapture before it, the Ishimura as a self-contained location was such a fascinating and immersive place to inhabit. It had you exploring each and every deck of the ship that held medical suites, hydroponic labs, ore processing stations, and crew quarters, with the net result creating a consistent and believable logic of how people could live and work on a deep space mining ship. By the penultimate chapter, you would get a real vivid impression of what the Yuichi Ishimura looked, sounded, and felt like in a way that only video games can really capture. And that impression is only amplified by the total makeover the ship gets in the remake. Similar to Callisto, there was an impressive amount of photorealistic detail poured into every square inch of Dead Space. Motive completely redesigned just about every asset in the game with high-res textures and complex levels of geometry. Every object has so many different qualities going on with textures, blemishes, translucency, and more that really sell the elaborate yet decrepit nature of the ship. The new volumetric fog and ray trace lighting effects are also fantastic additions to the remake. Great Horror relies heavily on their contrast between light and dark, and they are much more pronounced and atmospheric than they ever were in the original. You can especially see it in how reflections realistically bounce off different surfaces, how deep the shadows can really be once the power goes out, and how different light sources are casted around the environment in really impressive ways. When people played Dead Space for the first time back in 2008, I'm sure that many of them opened up the 3D map and immediately imagined a Metroidvania-like structure, with interconnected levels, non-linear objectives, and backtracking. However, it would only resemble Metroid Prime in form rather than function, as it was always designed to be this curated linear horror experience from the start. But now, Dead Space plays more like a Metroidvania than it ever has before. The tramps that were previously used to bookmark the beginning and end of each chapter have been de-emphasized so they function more like an unlockable fast travel system. New shortcuts have been strategically placed between decks, so that once a player finishes a chapter, they can naturally flow from one deck to the next to immediately start the next chapter, whether by traversing a maintenance tunnel, using an elevator, or going on a spacewalk. This interconnected level structure means that you can walk from the stern of the Ishimura all the way to the bow completely uninterrupted, which greatly strengthens the believability of this virtual labyrinth the player inhabits. And with backtracking being enabled for side missions and scavenging, the remake also has an intensity director that dynamically mixes up elements like audio, lighting, enemy spawns, and environmental effects upon return trips, ensuring that the player always has to contend with the unpredictable danger that can be lurking around every corner. While each deck generally retains the same level designs as the original, some of the floor plans have been altered or expanded in the remake by adding new rooms, connectors, and walkways. Some of these alterations help to make each deck of the Ishimura appear more realistic and practical, while some of them encourage spatial awareness of the physical space around the player. New supply closets are locked by fuses that have to be destroyed by shooting through broken windows, and later chapters have you shoot glowing spores to clear the organic corruption blocking the way ahead. It provides a brief diversion from the linear path, and forcing you to explore the environment more to find all the right angles, even if the act of shooting them gets more and more tedious as the game progresses. So the combat. Dead Space incorporates the franchise standard mechanics you would expect, like impalement and loot stomping. But like with everything else in the remake, it also drastically shakes up how the player is gradually empowered over the course of the game. Instead of having to find blueprints and purchase weapons from the store, weapons are now given to the player for free at certain chapters throughout the first half of the game. With such a small change, there is now a lot more freedom to experiment with different weapons against different enemy types. Weapon upgrading has also been extended beyond collecting power nodes, as base weapons only have a few upgrades available at the bench, with further paths being locked behind weapon parts that can either be directly purchased from the store, or collected from supply closets that require security clearances to access. On top of that, the reward for completing the Hunter side mission grants you a prototype stasis module that forces Necromorphs into a stun animation and literally burns their flesh off, which is a highly powerful and rewarding ability to have in Dead Space for the first time. Compared to the original, it's a solid compromise to foster meaningful engagement and exploration, and to amplify that feeling of progression and accomplishment with each new weapon or new capability added to your arsenal. Each weapon has been given a brand new alternate fire that makes them far more dynamic and rewarding than they ever were in the original. For example, the pulse rifle has the launcher from Dead Space 2 that can shoot grenades that double as proximity mines. The force gun shoots out a gravity well that can concentrate enemies and nearby objects towards it. And the contact beam now has a Ghostbuster style proton laser as its primary fire, with the charge shot being relegated to the alternate fire. With these changes, there are so many weapon combinations that are now possible, like grouping enemies together in a gravity well and then launching a bunch of grenades, or stun locking enemies in a firewall to easily dismember them. Or, as so many recent compilation videos have demonstrated, creatively placing line gun traps on objects and using kinesis to shred necromorphs into little pieces. The new dynamic gore system not only makes the violence more gruesome, but it also greatly improves the player feedback on weapons like the Force Gun and the Ripper. The relatively limited gore of the original made it difficult to trust whether they're having much effect on enemies, and put a lot more pressure on hit-scan weapons to deliver the belief of more reliable and consistent damage. But now, blasting the flesh off their bones until they are little more than skeletons, or shredding their bloody limbs off with a buzzsaw, gives combat much better feedback and makes Dead Space so much more satisfying to play. While the remake retains the same chapters and story beats as the original, everything else has been altered to give greater context to all the narrative elements that were already in play. Character dialogues have been rewritten, objectives and locations have been recontextualized, and subplots that previously only existed in the lore, like those involving Brant Harris, Jacob Temple, and Dr. Elizabeth Cross, have been repurposed into having more significant roles in the main plot and in side missions. And alongside new collectible logs, the narrative has also been integrated with the lore from the rest of the Dead Space universe, with characters from Downfall and Extraction being mentioned in audio and text logs, plot points like conversions from 2, and subtle references to the Brethren Moons from 3. It's nice to know that Motive still treats all the canon as worthwhile, and while it's a missed opportunity that they don't end up being more substantial in the long run, they all add up to make for a much richer and more comprehensive narrative experience. Newcomers to Dead Space get a crash core lore introduction to the rest of the franchise, and veterans like myself can enrich their experience from all the transmedia properties that the remake draws from. On top of all that, the pacing has also been adjusted in numerous places throughout the game. Take Chapter 5 for example, where instead of being told by Hammond to go back to the medical deck to make an enzyme to stop the poison air in hydroponics, the remake first has Isaac responding to his supposed distress call from Nicole on the medical deck. There, he interacts with Dr. Mercer and his slaughterhouse of test subjects on the way to his lab. After freezing him with stasis, Mercer teases Isaac with hints about Nicole and the marker that will come into play later in the story, and who later sets the stakes by threatening humanity with convergence on Earth. Instead of Isaac simply lifting the security lockdown in his office, he is also warned by a dying crew member that there was something poisoning the air on the hydroponics deck, and rather than simply venting the atmosphere as in the original, Mercer instead floods the entire deck with that same poisonous air that directly leads the player into Chapter 6. You can see small but significant changes like that all across the game, such as how Elizabeth reframes the Weezers as her former co-workers and her vengeance against Leviathan, or how the slasher that Hammond ejects in an escape pod is rewritten to become his undead friend Chen that eventually causes his death on the USM Valor. All of these changes work in service of adding more context and depth to the original narrative of Dead Space, and that also extends to the cast of characters as well. Gunnar Wright and Tanya Clark reprise their roles in Dead Space 2, and they do a fantastic job in breathing new life into their characters and setting the stage for their later dynamic in the sequel. It is quite a dramatic change for the better, seeing Isaac Clarke transform from a passive and voiceless protagonist into a well-defined character that can express his thoughts and exercise his agency with the people around him. Instead of Hammond or Kendra being the ones to boss him around the Ishimura, Isaac can take the initiative and decide things for himself, whether by reassuring Kendra about what needs to be done, expressing doubt about his abilities to Hammond, or getting angry at the unitologist Dr. Kyne. To be sure, there are still linear objectives in Dead Space that the player is forced to do, but emphasizing the agency of the player character helps to disguise that fact, and feel more involved in the process. There are also little details, like removing his helmet to speak with characters face to face, or hearing his voice change depending on his health or fatigue level, that go a long way in humanizing Isaac, and further strengthening the shared connection between player and protagonist. That same treatment is also shared with Nicole Brennan, and how dramatically she has been transformed in the remake. Before, she had virtually no character of her own and little narrative purpose in the original game. She existed as little more than a thin veneer of emotional stakes for the player character. But by retracing her steps across the Ishimura in a side mission, the player learns that Nicole actually played an important role in trying to stop the violence in the Ishimura, studying the origins of the necromorphs, and coming close to unlocking the secrets in the marker signal. It is revealed that she was previously a neuropsychiatrist that specialized in patients from the Church of Unitology, where she treated Octavia Clarke and started a relationship with her son. It was because of Isaac that she was encouraged to take on the job aboard the Ishimura, but just before she leaves, Isaac angrily blames her for the sudden murder-suicide of his parents, and leaves the last time that he ever saw Nicole on very bad terms. This new backstory not only provides a sorely needed emotional weight that was previously missing in Dead Space, but also eloquently describes how the marker was able to manipulate Isaac, and uses unresolved grief and regret over Nicole and his parents against them. The problem with how Isaac and Nicole are handled is that this crucial piece of content is locked behind an optional side mission, meaning that it is still entirely possible for players to completely miss it on their first playthrough. Without it, the critical path still shares all the same beats and shortcomings as the original. Relegating the new stuff to side content might be faithful in preserving the original pacing, but it is certainly disappointing that this important layer to the story didn't get put in, considering their willingness to change so many other areas. Although I still have a nostalgic preference for the novelty and purity of the original Dead Space, the remake is unmistakably a fantastic and well-crafted action horror game. For most people, it might just be the definitive version of Dead Space to play, and the decision to bundle Dead Space 2 with pre-orders makes it much easier for newcomers to get caught up with the rest of the franchise. It is certainly one of the brighter spots in the history of Dead Space, if only for being the first piece of franchise media in about a decade. It may not have been as desperately wanted or needed as compared to other games that perhaps deserve a remake more, but it definitely stands out as a model example of how good video game remakes can be, and how they can balance faithfulness with innovation to great success. It has been great to think that after a decade of radio silence, Dead Space fans not only have a top-to-bottom remake of the first game, but also a spiritual successor in the Callisto Protocol, and a spiritual predecessor in the Resident Evil 4 remake, and all of them releasing within months of each other. And then throughout 2023, that survival horror trend will continue on with games like Amnesia the Bunker, Alan Wake 2, and remakes of System Shock, Alone in the Dark, and Silent Hill 2. The original Dead Space may not have been the evergreen blockbuster that Electronic Arts wanted it to be, but its influence as a 7th gen cult classic and an icon of survival horror is still carrying on 15 years later. In some respects, it is a little unfair to compare the Callisto Protocol against the 2023 remake of Dead Space. It had the difficult task of launching a brand new IP at a brand new studio that had never worked together, unlike the remake that only had to polish and add on top of what already came before. But what kept Callisto from finding the same level of success was its ultimate failure to fully distinguish itself from Dead Space, which the unfortunate timing in the remake only exacerbated. In that sense, it shares many similarities with Back 4 Blood, particularly in its failure to evolve beyond or live up to the nostalgia of its spiritual predecessor. Callisto focused too heavily on its audiovisual presentation to carry the experience, and comparatively little on its gameplay, its narrative, and all the elements that make for an effective action horror game. But despite the criticisms that I've leveled against the Callisto Protocol in this video, I do want to see Striking Distance learn from their mistakes and further iterate upon their designs in future sequels. I would love nothing more than to see more games like Callisto that carry forward the legacy of Dead Space, while bringing their own innovations and creativity to its unique brand of sci-fi action horror. And as for the Dead Space remake, it's still hard to accept that it ever needed to be remade in the first place. But now that it's here, it would be wrong not to call it a fantastic and well-designed game. It makes subtle yet significant changes to its presentation, gameplay, narrative, and progression, while still retaining the core of what made Dead Space such a sleeper hit back in 2008. With their work on Star Wars and Dead Space, Motive is proving themselves to be a reliable single-player studio within EA, but they still need to push themselves farther. Beyond their repertoire of licensed movie games, like their upcoming Iron Man project, Motive still needs their own original hit, that one shining star, that one little corner of the video gaming space they can fully claim as their own. They know now what it takes to make a great Dead Space game, and the future of the franchise is now brighter than it ever has been in the past decade. One only hopes that instead of playing it safe with yet more remakes as they seem want to do, Motive will hopefully pull the trigger on Dead Space 4, and finally be the ones to push Dead Space into brand new directions and to newfound success. But while the latter may have been more successful and better received than the former, both studios still have the opportunity to tap into something really special. The former developers of Visceral have long since moved on, but they will always have the distinction of being responsible for the fondly remembered legacy of Dead Space. And for all the developers at Striking Distance and Motive, they have the opportunity to build upon that legacy as well, if they decide to push themselves to that next level as a studio. Then, they too might be able to find their own place within the pantheon of survival horror, just like that 2008 game managed to do all those years ago.